Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
It is Friday, August 9th, 2024, and Jeremy, we do officially have a Democratic Party ticket now. It is indeed going to be the ticket of Kamala Harris, and or as you had made the case for in our last recording, Governor Tim Walz from Minnesota. As with any choice that we have, in terms of our current political system, it's definitely an imperfect one. But it is, I think, in a world of levels of imperfection as far as where we're at and where we're standing at. I definitely don't believe it is certainly it's not the worst choice. A matter of fact, in terms of like the where we're at in the moment, can't think of honestly a better, and I use that term with some reservations, choice for a VP in this moment in terms of the of where things are and say some of the ramifications and stakes that are at play when you consider like continuing threat of the MAGA 2.0 threat. Now some of the things are even coming out with like election recertification efforts being scuttled potentially at the local level going forward for the upcoming election. And the choice of Tim Walz really, especially when you think about like the combination of potentially some forward positive movement being made in certain areas of policy, and then also obviously the immediate importance of stopping this MAGA 2.0 threat from getting back into the highest offices in the land. In a world of imperfect choices, I think that Tim Walz is about the least imperfect choice, considering some of the options that are out there, and then also the moment that we're in, and the and what's a lot of the things I think that are at stake right now.
Yeah, I would say so. And I do think that the country and definitely Kamala Harris dodged a bullet in terms of what looked to have been a really serious push to get the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, in as the VP candidate. And at the last moments, a lot of journalism and digging of research began to really expose that this was not just, as all these people try to say, that Shapiro was Jewish. There's continuing to be that kind of discourse, even it's being pushed intensely by some of the opponents, mainly from outside of the party, but also inside the party too, that this actually had to do the Harris choice of Walz over Shapiro represents a much deeper question of rising anti-Semitism per se. But what it really looked like was that there's this deep question in terms of Shapiro uh, in relationship specifically to Israeli state power. And on the surface, it's been explained that the vibes were wrong in terms of Shapiro in his interview with Harris and her people seemed to come in and be asking a lot of questions about what his role would be, and there is a larger discourse about how the kind of intense aspiration he has. Like he obviously wants to be president. So that kind of combination where, the person backing up, the person who steps into power if something happens to the president, having actually gone to Israel for many months in some kind of service program, volunteering at an Israeli military base. Now it's being downplayed by Shapiro and its people as never really doing any military service per se. There's still a question, did he don the uniform? What's going on there? And, in the background here, of course, is this private Jewish, I would call parochial school that Akeba in Pennsylvania, that both Jake Tapper and Shapiro went to. Now, I believe Tapper's a few years older, so I don't believe they were necessarily classmates there. Maybe they were. Maybe they were at the same school, but at different levels, middle
I
school
think
versus high
Tapper
school.
was wasn't Tapper like the same class as Monica Lewinsky?
Oh, I've forgotten that. Oh, that's pretty interesting, huh? Wow, because of that, because then the other piece of this too is in addition to that school, which it was formed fairly early. I think it got going in the 40s, solidified into the 50s, and it was seen as a direct affront actually to the established American Jewish reform uh, Judaism approach, which was very much more about Jewish kids should be in American public schools. There should be a civil integration kind of approach rather than a this parochial private approach. And so there's a deeper question there, I think, that continues to deserve some kind of delving into. But just the surface level of it, and this question of Tapper being probably the leader in terms of the whole CNN debate operation that instigated the entire questioning of Biden. I believe we still have our suspicions about what those forces intended in terms of calling the Biden question. I still believe that they intended to try to eliminate the entire Biden-Harris ticket, go for an open convention, very chaotic on the surface and alleged to be democratic on the surface, but really run by party power players when it actually came down to it. And potentially I think they wanted to choose a whole nother ticket, maybe even having Shapiro at the top of the ticket. That's what I would imagine. And this is why then after Biden dropped out, but immediately endorsed Harris, his own vice president pick, as his endorsed candidate. And she basically almost immediately coalesced large portions of both the party base and many of the party power players, including like Nancy Pelosi, who was also, the public iron fist in terms of the Biden dropping out question behind Harris. That this was meant to go another way. I get the sense by the whole whatever the Tapper Shapiro network really is. And then what you brought up of Tapper and Lewinsky brings in this whole other question of what then began to be exposed about Shapiro. Shapiro actually worked at the Israeli consulate in DC, I believe, right at the time that Netanyahu was first coming into power as prime minister, and he was working in Shapiro was working in what could only be called a hasbara role, Israeli propaganda. He was doing educational outreach on behalf of the Israeli government. So people wanted to spin this. There was all these people saying, "Oh, you can't. The Democratic Party is anti-Semitic. You can't be a Jew and be at the in a place of power." And people just immediately started pointing out, "No, this is actually the Republican Party." Especially in you know contradiction to how Jewish power and Zionist and Israeli hacky the Republican Party is. They actually don't put their Jews front and center. They don't. Of course, the Democratic Party has many more Jews in prominent roles in a way that's obviously overrepresentative.
Jeremy, if it was a Jewish thing, I think people would be the same people would have a problem with would be railing against Harris's husband, Doug Emhoff. But there's the fact is that there's it's not that they're not, and that there's reasons for this obvious targeting of making sure Shapiro did not get on the ticket that has nothing to do with his ethnicity or his and I mean it goes into these very deep reasons that are like to the level of where you have somebody who would be in the vice president's office who would I think you can make a strong case for openly would put the interests of a foreign nation over the interest of the United States of America, and that's where it comes down to.
And then there's a lot of questions about that And this even, I think Cenk Uygur pointed this out in his last ditch attempt to say that Shapiro was the best candidate for Harris, the most progressive candidate, all based on this line of that Shapiro was going after Wall Street in terms of the state funds, in terms of retirement funds, and all that. But when you look at it, there was that, but then Shapiro also advocated for a bunch of money to be invested in Israel bonds. So in a certain way, you could say that Shapiro actually looked like he was, going against aspects of, Jewish power in an American context that's obviously, part of Wall Street and all of that, and shifting things toward a much more Israeli centric kind of dynamic. But then Uygur also then said, well, he's also the most, he led Biden Harris in terms of calling Netanyahu bad names, how Netanyahu was one of the worst leaders in history. So that should be addressed. But as we know, you can have all kinds of people who say certain things at a certain moment in time who look like uber hawks on an individual or on a country. And either they are too late or they are actually just posturing and trying to cloak themselves in a new updated current to the moment kind of narrative framework. And so it is interesting that we are having a moment of what Bill Clinton called into question at the same time as the Lewinsky scandal was breaking. Obviously a lot of questions surrounding the orchestration of the Lewinsky scandal and the timing of it, as Netanyahu comes in. There's another time storming the White House, maybe in that case, and Bill Clinton responding, I think, to his own people after his meeting with Netanyahu of who the GD superpower is. And so we are now at that moment, actually, at what some people will want to call the rest of the Biden, less than 100 days in the White House, at least, before the transition.
Jeremy, I was going to,
Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to compare real quick, like Shapiro's criticism of Netanyahu. Like, I think for me, it kind of, I think of the way John Bolton came out against Trump, and and like and I mean there was a convenience to that, obviously, of like, but I don't like because John Bolton, in a very, I think ultimately a very limited fashion, points out like Trump, he's got certain tendencies that are going to be problematic for the country. Like I don't take John Bolton's criticism of Trump post being removed from the administration as like a serious attempt for him to try and like really like move things into a better direction as a result of that criticism. So but for me, it seems like that could be there might be some type of dynamic there with the Shapiro, and that's what I thought of, like it, even like the motivations of it, like okay, but ultimately like the history and the record shows like that there's something else going on. So I thought of Bolton Trump as a parallel.
That's a good point, and the opposite of that is like JD Vance and Trump, where it goes from could be like one of the worst leaders for the Republicans to a great guy who I want to serve, right? So those kinds of flips happen all the time in many different ways, and they don't seem to mean much, I don't think, especially in the context here of where now it's like people want to paint it as Joe Biden's lame duck, rest of his presidency. But the real question on the table is whether this is going to be a Biden of the lame duck, or angry, the angry geezer, or I would say the aggressive goose, potentially wants even maybe exact some personal revenge if Biden knows what was really represented by this push of the Tapper Shapiro network, we may call it. And be especially then, that whole question of Shapiro as VP, when Netanyahu leaves the country where he's been given his command from what is meant to be the senior partner in the U.S.-Israel special relationship to get the ceasefire hostage release deal done, that he immediately goes back and goes on a series of assassination uh, voyages in other sovereign countries, including at the heart of Iran, at the heart of when they're about to inaugurate their new president, and assassinates the political leader of Hamas that had been engaged in political negotiations, and remembering the whole logic of Netanyahu and his network and their regime in backing Hamas as a way to stave off not just a quote unquote two-state solution, but really a political solution to the long-term Israeli military occupation of Palestine. And so instead of going to call the political question after October 7th, of course Netanyahu went into what he said to Douglas Murray, one of his two special guests along with Elon Musk. This was not what I have always wanted to do, what I'm doing in Gaza now, but there was not the willpower or the willingness of both the domestic and the international community to go along with this. So Netanyahu goes ahead, and actually, this is why I've been calling it was an attempted national genocide against the Palestinian people that included a physical genocide in part, or who knows, intent in terms of whole. So the escalation of assassination, especially in terms of the political question of the moment, right after Netanyahu leaves the United States, really then calls into question, the putting someone who worked for Netanyahu's government, right? That's what it means that Shapiro worked for the Israeli consulate in DC when Netanyahu came into power. Shapiro worked for Netanyahu. So then to have this leader be the one who's going around assassinating people, and then people get put into a new position just on the surface alone, if it weren't too much to have someone who's actually, served or volunteered in some way for a foreign military, in this case, a foreign military where there is a major conflict in terms of American policy versus Israeli policy on the table. If that weren't enough, then of course this question of someone who actually worked for the guy who's doing the assassinations, who would be the one to then step in if anything were to happen to a potential Harris president, just way too much. And so it is at the very least a pretty good sign that did not happen. So there's that. And then the other side of it is that it looked like, just politically and in terms of policy, Walz actually was the best choice of the VP candidates that were being talked about. And so I do think we should look at how heavy the disinformation and propaganda, now looking back, was around Shapiro. Shapiro was seen as a massive favorite in like the betting markets, all the way to like a lot of the quote unquote mainstream reporting, where they would even leave Walz off the list of people being considered, all the way up into the last moment where they had to admit that it was finally down to Walz and Shapiro. So the fact that it was being perpetrated by so-called journalists and analysts, that it was Shapiro was basically a lock up until the very moment when he was not, and that he was actually then finally there to introduce Harris and Walz in Philadelphia. That's a big deal. But Walz just really made the most political sense too, in terms of he really does have probably one of the most effective records as a current governor in the United States, and seems to be deploying policy that can be seen as a combination of real old school, very Americana type, FDR style progressivism of some sort, while also fitting into the cultural moment in terms of protecting gay and trans rights and women's rights and all that thing. And then so that then combined with his background as a National Guardsman, which has now become the major vector. Actually, they're the sort of the Trumpist propagandists are really pushing a line that there is a new Swift boat scandal, and actually it's the same guy who orchestrated the Swift boat attack on John Kerry during the year that John Kerry lost the election, that we now know was also combined with apparent election rigging and fraud, especially in Ohio in 2004. The same guy now orchestrating a National Guard, hit against Walz, saying that he's now going to drop out. That's not going to happen. And the timing of all this is very interesting too, because Walz had served in the National Guard for, I think, over 20 years. And then the post 9/11, he re-enlists. Actually, he was actually, I believe, done with his service by 9/11 and then re-enlists after 9/11. And then right before his unit is going to be called in to go to Iraq, he's already declared his candidacy for Congress, and then declares that he is going to step away from a leadership role in his National Guard unit. So they're trying to say that the way he's defined his ultimate rank is stolen valor, and that he was a coward in terms of actually going to lead his unit into combat, or sort of the attacks. But I think the policy is actually way more interesting, and I actually appreciate that this is going to give us a chance to discuss questions of the post 9/11 era, yes, the Iraq War, and that whole time, because I think if you delve into it, you'll find that Walz actually ends up being maybe one of the more good faith anti-war Congress people of that era, even though he, like most all of the Congress people, okayed funding for the Iraq War after it had started. But there are these pieces that show that one of his takes was that he was willing to give funding for the Iraq War as long as that the certain cash was earmarked specifically for Iraqi political rebuilding and infrastructure rebuilding, and not to escalate the actual combat and war. And you'll see that he ends up actually in one of the more anti-war groups of congresspeople, even in relationship to the Syrian conflict, and whether Obama should escalate it by bombing Syria, and he was against all of that. So, he actually does have these kinds of, peace progressive type credentials.
And once again, that's not to say, it's not perfect. It's not even, I would say, it wasn't even sufficient for, what we need in that position, as we keep pointing out. But you're absolutely right here. And I wonder, with regards to Walz, if in the class of post 9/11 military enlisters, if Tim Walz would be closer maybe to a Pat Tillman, the football star who volunteered to go to Afghanistan, and then ends up before the strange friendly fire incident actually becomes a vocal, at least in letter form, opponent, a recent written form opponent of the mission in Afghanistan and what was going on there. Or if you'd be closer to maybe a Tulsi Gabbard, who is got listed in the military post 9/11 and is seen now as like the principled, anti-war person who as recently as 10 years ago, while she was starting to really putting the pressure on the Obama administration for not declaring what radical Islamic extremism for what it is, was palling around with the Adels, I believe, with our Shmuley Botiak, and speaking at the Christians United for Israel conference. So, I'm not comparing Walz to Pat Tillman, but like in terms of, I would say that there's a I think there's a bit of a more genuine, my sense is of like in terms of a post 9/11 environment with regards to a Walz compared to a Tulsi Gabbard. I'll also ask, Walz was opposed to the Iraq War all the way back in 2003, and I wonder if I don't know, Tucker Carlson, who what came around in what, like 2018 or so, about how the Iraq War was a bad thing, if he's going to point out Tim Walz being an opponent of the of going into Iraq, even right as the actual debate about going into war was taking place, like
when
having
it
the
mattered, and while being a soldier
right.
himself, and while then anticipating being a congress
Right.
person.
And also, and not, what was Tucker had what, a history of writing for the Weekly Standard, which was the PNAC media outlet.
Yes, yes. Yeah. So I think, these are obviously, just as we identified that the question of Israel Palestine was going to be the Achilles heel of the Biden administration, turned out to be even worse than we thought, I think, in many ways, in not anticipating the October 7th and Gaza genocide, the severity of all of that. But we are at this, the question is now being called, both in terms of the ongoing Biden presidency, but also in terms of the Harris-Walz candidacy. And just, in the recent days, over the course of the last week, really, it's become more and more public that Biden, it being reported that Biden believed that Netanyahu was lying to him about the question of ceasefire and hostage negotiation. And now, even just today, John Kirby, National Security Advisor, it has come out saying that Bezalel Smotrich, who I think very recently, I think it was Smotrich or Ben Gvir, one of them, I think it was Smotrich, one of them actually said that there should be a mass genocide, physical genocide, starvation. We should just kill the Palestinians in Gaza, but we can't get away with it, is basically was the statement from one of those guys. But now even Kirby is publicly disclosing that that Biden believes that these people are going to trying to sacrifice their own hostages in order to destroy the ceasefire negotiation. And so this is now becoming an interesting question that is being called about what Biden is willing or not willing to do after I think it's been clear, it's been proven out that he failed in his attempted bear hug of Netanyahu, and he has earned the nomenclature of Genocide Joe. And now that question is being passed over to his candidate, his nominee, his endorsed nominee, Kamala Harris, for president. And that the first major, is being seen as a major misstep by the Harris campaign, is in the heart of this question of Palestine, in Michigan, Detroit, and really both the geographical and the moral heart of what became the uncommitted movement, where they were able to organize hundreds of thousands of declared Democratic Party voters around the country to say that if there were not a major shift on Israel-Palestine from, arming these genocidaires in Israel to, at the very least, getting a ceasefire done, if not something more bigger in terms of answering the larger political question of Israel-Palestine and Palestinian rights to return to dignity, to what's always used in a Zionist fashion, political self-determination, that these questions are now firmly on the table. And so I guess what happened is that before this pretty big rally that Harris-Walz were holding in Michigan, there were a few leaders of the uncommitted movement who were in the photo line, who were both able to get a conversation in with Harris and Walz about a question of ending basically an arms embargo against Israel in terms of the situation there. And it was said by both of these leaders that both Harris and Walz appeared emotionally open and connected to their despair, while also saying they were open to policy questions and more conversation down the line. Now, there was an immediate response by Harris's security advisor the next day, saying that she is not open to the questions of an arms embargo against Israel. And then, additionally, right after the event got going, in the middle of it somewhere, there were a different group of Palestinian solidarity protesters who started like a chant in the middle of Harris's speech, and something about Harris, Harris, you can't hide. We don't want to vote for genocide, I think was what they were saying. So they weren't accusing her of genocide, even though she's been, part of the Genocide Joe operation, obviously. Now, we've talked about how she, at the very least, was the face of the more compassionate concerns of the Biden administration in terms of being the first sort of high-level member of the Biden White House to call for a ceasefire publicly. But then Harris seemed to allow it to go on for a while, but then responded to it in a way that was very it was just bad. It was politically off step, and it was morally outrageous, actually. I think, in the way that she responded to it. Basically, she said, if you keep on chanting that, you're gonna help Donald Trump get elected. Meanwhile, I'm speaking. And so, so people are saying, oh, what a boss move. She shut down these interlopers who are just trying to get Donald Trump elected. But everybody being reasonable knows that there was a way more politically capable and really morally aligned with the severity of the moment and the levels of Palestinian suffering and death and casualties of all sorts in the moment. And some of them, like family members, are the people that are organizing all of this. Like, imagine what you would do if it were American bombs killing your family right now, in another country. What would you be willing to interject and cause a little bit of a disruption at a rally? Yeah, I think most people would. So the fact that she seemed to get stuck in some kind of a little bit of an authoritarian complex, a little bit, it was not a good sign in terms of all of this. But at the very least, it's created a conversation, and we will see where it goes. And so I think this is one of the dynamics to look for in terms of, all right, now Biden is not a lame duck. He could be an aggressive goose, angry geezer, but it's up to him. He's now been sort of freed of the constraints to some extent of having to, be politic in terms of seeking another term in office. And if he were really wanting to help serve his nominee, Kamala Harris, he would also use some GD superpower, in this mix here, in terms of what he's now publicly identified as someone who's lying to his face, Netanyahu, and not only Netanyahu, but the people that surround him in power in the Israeli regime, of actually desiring to fully physically genocide the Palestinian people, but just being held back by American constraint and international sentiment, but also being the ones who are attempting to directly disrupt and cancel what the open American policy here is, which is get the hostage deal done, ceasefire now. And by the way, it's also now come out that Hamas leadership has called for the release of Marwan Barghouti as part of the hostage deal. And it appears that the Americans back this call for Marwan Barghouti to be released. And this Marwan Barghouti appears to me to be really the best hope of a Palestinian, a recognized Palestinian political leader who would actually be able to bridge the divide that was really manufactured and amplified by the Israelis over a long period of time between geographically the West Bank and Gaza, and of course, the PLO and its different, assorted historical outgrowth groups, but then also Hamas. And so someone like Marwan Barghouti, if he could be released in this, there you would then actually have a Palestinian leader who would demand, I think, an actual potential political conversation at the very least, if not push it towards some kind of at least temporary political resolution in relationship to Palestinian lives, dignity, and sovereignty. So this is the moment. A lot of this we're going to get a sense. It just got released that a combination of the Qatari, Egyptian, and American governments are demanding publicly. And then this is also then in relationship to the question of Iran that is still just floating out there. How will Iran respond to this Israeli attack on their sovereignty and the assassination of Hania in Tehran? And there is a lot of talk of, Iran is up against the wall in terms of its credibility really in the region, having taken the role of the main patron in the Muslim world of the Palestinian cause, to greater and lesser good faith, actually. And a lot of it just realpolitik and geopolitik, even in relationship to the Iranian strategy after the Islamic Revolution to maintain long-term covert diplomatic relationships with the Israeli highest level of the government, while then beginning to step into this fold of being the main Muslim backer of the Palestinian cause. And so they're being sort of in a tough spot. I don't think the Iranians do not want to actually get into some kind of conflagration with Israel. They know Israel has shown its willingness to preemptively act in massive military way. And so just given any kind of cause, which includes the Israeli government saying that if any civilian Israelis are targeted by Iran, they should expect massive retaliation. So that's the question on the table that's still out there as this public commanding, really, by the Qataris, the Egyptians, and the Americans for Hamas and the Netanyahu regime to come to an agreement. I think by the end of next week, maybe. I think maybe somewhere in the realm of like the August 15th or 16th. So there is a lot on the table that includes the question of massive conflagration in the Middle East in terms of Iran, Israel. And so I think we're gonna begin to see where a lot of this is headed pretty soon. And, so then the time in terms of these Palestinian solidarity protesters of different sorts, the sort of more diplomatic, civil, policy-oriented inside game of the uncommitted movement in the photo line directly making contact with Walz and Harris, and the more disruptive approach, I think, are exactly correct right now. And I hope that approach will continue in a focused and disciplined fashion in relationship to the upcoming DNC in Chicago. But I guess I'll just finish this up by saying that the question of the public discourse around all of this is really the key thing, I think, right now, even in relationship to what comes beyond well, what happens with the Gaza genocide operation in the immediate days to weeks, because there are obviously much deeper and much bigger issues to contend with here in terms of the U.S.-Israel special relationship, the entire rubric of the war on terror, who was actually the prime mover of the Iraq War, or of 9/11 itself, or even of questions of assassinations all the way back to the 60s. So there are a lot of issues that are not, that even much of the Palestinian solidarity movement shy away from even considering or bringing to the table. Meanwhile, you have the sort of JQ, people who want to sort of take the moment of Palestinian suffering and make it all about the totality of their JP issues. And so there's a lot rests, I think, in how we navigate these really deeper political questions, both in this moment and beyond. And I guess my sense is that the pick of Harris-Walz as the candidate, the ticket for the Democrats, at the very least, there is a suggestion that that deep core political speech is on the table in terms of these very important issues.
Yes, and we've been we've been talking about it for the last several years now. I think since 11/9, and certainly post 11/9, but obviously the groundwork has been laid for the continuing escalating moment in terms of like the ultimate, what has to be some sort of ultimate, like day of reckoning when it comes to the nature of the U.S.-Israel special relationship, quote unquote, and then how even the rise of MAGA and 11/9 and everything since then has actually turned that relationship on its head in a lot of ways, and the nature of it, and we've been looking at this from both the perspective of within the government, within the U.S. government itself, for policy community itself, with regards to this state of Israel and the long term, quote unquote, bipartisan, quote unquote, special relationship, and then obviously how it's evolved or devolved in the days really since I think the rise of you can look long term, the rise of the Likud party beginning in the 1970s, and then going into the rise of Netanyahu, and the many ways that Netanyahu's has directly contradicted and been a detriment to both like an actual healthy U.S.-Israel relationship, and even you could argue a lot of, I think, increasingly from a military perspective, Israel's actual national security best interests. We've been looking at it from this for a while now, and then also from the perspective of the question of Israel and support for Israel in in America that is, or in a Western world in a lot of ways. It's not just the U.S., it's also Europe, that has changed demographically, and where cultural and societal attitudes have changed in a lot of ways, in many different ways over the past number of decades. And I think 10/7, at the very least, I think delayed or helped to negate potential move that could have been made in a Biden and Harris administration. Obviously, with 10/7, you have to reassert the support for Israel, the typical talking points about basically it in a lot of ways it did, and there were still some aberrations to that. Let me look at Chuck Schumer's Senate speech and look at some other things. There were still some aberrations, but by and large, it was still the bipartisanship of rallying around America's greatest ally. And after the worst terror attack in its history, what 29/11s, as Netanyahu called it, and
Yes, yeah.
and so you had that, and there was a delay there. But even as a result of that, there's still the campus protests really picked up at the to the levels that we hadn't seen in many years, as we've talked about before on the show, and there. And now I think we are starting to, although the question of what happens in terms of like escalation or de-escalation on a uh, regional level is key here. It's of importance here, I think, to what could or could not happen going forward. But we are kind of back into this, where I think obviously the immediate specter and the immediate aftermath of 10/7 is worn off and you're back into where there's another bit of an, even the battle over Shapiro is kind of an example of this, to where once again, you are in a position where the conversation about like the nature of the relationship going forward is getting back in there, even with a ticket like Harris-Walz, Tim Walz, who was seen as, I guess you would call him maybe a reliable, quote unquote, pro-Israel Democrat in the House. He was, if not, maybe a reliable J Street Democrat, maybe somewhat APAC adjacent to some level or another. But not a guy who's going to put like the interests of like the hardline Netanyahu faction over like what an American foreign policy interest is for the state of Israel. And we could argue and go back and forth and get into both the negatives of that as well. But it's not, it's going to be very much going to be somebody who looks at this from like I think a more traditional U.S. foreign policy perspective on where the relationship with Israel goes, as opposed to these hardliners who just want to continue to escalate, both in the way of increasing its power, increasing the takeover of Palestinian land, and also increasing the alienation of its greatest American ally in a lot of ways, as there is a desire to move away from having the constraints of the U.S. Oversight in terms of what certain elements in Israel are allowed and not allowed to do. So I think we are still in this where we are reaching. I think the once again getting into these getting seriously into the weeds again. I think of both the nature of what the U.S. Israel relationship's going to look like going forward, and then also dealing with with the question of where does Israel fit into in America, perspective-wise. It's changing demographically and changing societally, and that's, I think, is going to become more and more paramount going forward here, because of the question of the campus protest and the uncommitted movement, and that there is a level of pressure that can be put on a Democratic ticket at this point that certainly, sure as hell, cannot be put on a Donald Trump J.D. Vance ticket when it comes to potentially making at least some semblance of positive, or what could be at least less negative steps going forward in terms of the nature of how these dynamics around Israel and power politics are going to be handled. So I think it is I think we're back to that. And then Jeremy, I also wanted to say that much like foreign policy wise, I think this is a significant campaign ticket in terms of like an actual, maybe you could call like an actual, one of the closer things you'll get to maybe a progressive outlook on foreign policy, in terms of like maybe an actual American interest, anti-war, anti-imperial perspective. And it's not a perfect one, of course. But as opposed to like these these non-interventionism things that ultimately I think fit into a combination of like of the culture wars, by stop the wars overseas and bring the wars home to fight them at home, and then also the very much figuring into foreign elements that do not want the U.S. to have like established interests overseas. I think we're reaching that with the Walz ticket, but then also you brought up earlier like some of the domestic policies and what is called prairie populism, or maybe the spirit of Midwest of Wisconsin and Minnesota, and Tim Walz kind of representing this, and where we've gone in terms of what some people might call post-COVID America. And I don't mean to say post-COVID in terms of like COVID's gone or anything, but that's just kind of a term people use, like post-lockdowns and the changes in our society that have taken place since since the 2020-2021 time period, and reckonings and similar reckonings in terms of the to what can be seen. I think I saw very clearly when I was in Kansas City for a couple months that the levels of homelessness have reached crisis levels in many cities, and that combined with drug epidemics, opioid epidemics, increased awareness and attempts to really like understanding that like these things do need to be dealt with in a serious manner. And then also on top of that, even these social policies that you talked about, that I know some people will try to attack, like the efforts for making food and meals accessible to all school children, or What I think then I think becomes a very nasty twist on trying to put, maybe sanitary precautions in place for young women in schools, and that becomes, tampons him, and he wants the boys to use tampons so they can turn into girls or whatever. And we are reaching where I think, you have a ticket like this or a person like this to represent a moment in terms of a shifting of awareness of these matters. And as always, there is a need for a healthy public debate about what exactly the role of the government should or shouldn't be in terms of these matters. But I do think that we've also been, as a society, we've been so inclined, and Democrats have a lot of your establishment Democrats have contributed to this, as well as the obvious GOP economic interest over the last number of decades of the as far as economically speaking, our philosophy on things, and in terms of policies that benefit the top in our society. And the way I think that there's been a lot of propaganda in that regards, in terms of the going power of the free market, quote unquote, and the evils of government intervention, and the fact that that the wealthy need to be taken care of and everybody else will be taken care of as a result. That now I think you're getting a candidate and a governor who is actually looking to bring about serious efforts to really I think mitigate a lot of problems, especially in areas where you might have more disadvantaged areas. And so this is quite a moment in this regard as well, domestic moment of I think a Tim Walz with an actual what could be called a Midwestern progressive, right at the heart of the Democratic presidential ticket with the vice president's office, in addition, of course, to Kamala Harris, and where she seems to stray away from certain economic and otherwise norms as far as conventional wisdom of maybe you could call it maybe the neoliberal consensus in terms of certain economic and other outlooks.
This is good points. And yeah, I mean, I think that the potential of this moment is that we are going to, even these like lines of attack on Walz specifically, I think will all end up in really important areas of conversation. From one that I already mentioned in terms of the attack on his quote unquote so-called stolen valor, and the question of being basically accusing him of being like abandoning his unit in terms of the Iraq War, all the very serious questions around that, around the origins of the Iraq War, the clean break program, for example, who stood down in the Democratic Party in intent to really get to the heart of the Bush-Cheney, both 9/11 and Iraq War deceptions. What was the role of Netanyahu? Was it as a great wise statesman, as J.D. Vance was just even texting to Charles Johnson just last year about how if the entire West had listened to the great statesman Bibi Netanyahu, the Iraq War wouldn't have happened. Meanwhile, that's already been fact-checked in the Washington Post, linking to all of the things that we've talked about over many years in terms of Netanyahu being a key proponent of the Iraq War and the idea of regime change and so-called nation building in the Middle East, and the whole Natan Sharansky angle and all of that. But even like questions of what you brought up in terms of food policy, and the fact that it's obvious that a lot of like the MAGA angle on this is that these are communists. These are, Harris and Walz are just barely cloaked communists. And what's so interesting about it is it's actually very sort of American and even business friendly policy that Walz, for example, was deploying in Minnesota, to the point of where he got attacked for the Republicans for not doing needs-based food aid, and that it's actually almost the opposite in some ways of like this idea that you brought up of like, trickle down economics and sort of Reaganomics. And if the wealthy are taken care of, then enough of that will trickle down to those below them in the economic hierarchy. Instead, the way that Walz approached it in terms of food for school children was no needs-based testing. It's actually sort of, trickle up economics, or I would say roots up, like a tree kind of system where you take care of the poor and the middle class in terms of food, and the wealthy will be in a better shape anyways. And so, and there's a lot of reasons why this made a lot of sense too. It eliminated, instead of doing needs-based testing that includes a lot of financial forms and tax forms for already burdened parents to fill out in order to qualify for it. No, it's everybody's qualified. And then it helps de-escalate the sort of the culture war dynamics of the economic war, because everybody in the lunchroom is together, and there's not this idea of, oh, these are the kids who need help or receive aid or that kind of thing. And so it makes a lot of sense in terms of like what some of the best principles, I would say, of like this very Americana based pragmatic prairie type of populism, progressive populism to some extent, you might even call it, actually makes a lot of sense. And then I think we'll begin to have the conversation about questions of homelessness and the holding of land and tax policy. And I'll take every opportunity to reinsert the questions of land value taxes and Henry George and Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine's crucial pamphlet, Agrarian Justice, and the idea that the lands are some way a commons. And so if people want to control, create private property, which is a helpful and important natural law concept, that someone has sort of control over their own home, even up and against like governments and corporations, let alone other people, that they then, basically have to give restitution to those who are not able to then hold, or who are not trying to sort of hold land in that private kind of way. And so you begin to have things like natural trusts, national natural trusts in terms of right to domicile, right to land, and all these kinds of things are very, very effective too. The land value tax, in terms of the Henry George approach, has already been recognized by economists as not only the fairest tax, but also the most efficient tax, and that it actually unleashes economic activity rather than having all these deadbeat landlords or slumlords who sit on land, don't do anything with it, wait for there to be massive public investment in the surrounding area over, years to decades, and then basically extract all of that public investment in their either corporate or private, profit seizing. And so there's a lot of, possibility here to actually talk about serious policy, and not just in this question of foreign policy, Israel-Palestine, the U.S.-Israel special relationship, even though that I think will be front and center, at least over the next month or two, as well it should be. So that, the other line of attack that's going to be levied at Walz, for example, and Harris's choice of Walz, is the question of the 2020, Minneapolis, riots and fires, and the whole George Floyd, Derek Chauvin incident, which we will then be able to get back into the deep politics of that, and what was the real nature of that specific incident between George Floyd and Derek Chauvin. Was this a question of, just something that happened, and that they didn't know each other and it just happened out of nowhere? Or was this actually, like we've talked about, most of these kinds of apparently overdetermined events that have these obviously overdetermined responses and outcomes of all sorts that serve different power structures in different ways? They almost all are some kind of deep event. They're almost always tied into deep politics. And so we'll be able to have a chance to then wade back into, oh, did Derek Chauvin and George Floyd actually work together at a local sort of organized crime involved club? Are there questions of drug running that run through certain dirtied up police units? Was there, money laundering being covered up? What was the role of foreign intelligence units that were being inserted in police units throughout the Midwest, mainly from sort of Chicago, the sort of the Israeli stronghold in Chicago on up the I-35 corridor into the Minneapolis area, and even local, not only police training in Israel, but actually Israeli inserts into some of these police intelligence units, as we covered at the time. So a lot of this is going to, I think, lend itself to having these much more serious conversations, not only about policy, about what do we do about food security. That was the other thing that Walz was interested in terms of supplying food. Minnesota, actually a crucial food supplier in the United States. Minnesota, I believe, supplies at least 2/3 of the Thanksgiving turkeys, really, in the United States, but also just a major food producer. That part of Walz, what he was doing too with this, putting the food on display in the public school system in Minnesota, was, it's not only like, are we all taken care of, but also, we need the people of the most means, the wealthiest, to also know what the nature of the food supply is, whether they want their children exposed to the food supply. How good is our food supply? And so that begins to get into the heart of even some of the best aspects of what, like, for example, I've seen RFK Jr.'s policy, the best parts of what he actually is proposing in terms of policy. I don't trust him, at all in terms of commander-in-chief potential. Foreign affairs at all, obviously, is the whole Israeli compromise issue, Russian questions, and more in terms of RFK Jr. But domestically, RFK Jr., in terms of his background as like a hard-nosed environmental justice lawyer and pharmaceutical justice lawyer, he has a lot of the possibilities in terms of how you might actually fix the shadow side of the administrative state, and what's really about corporate capture of some of these regulatory agencies, not by destroying them, but by actually, in some ways, utilizing both the legal system and the actual market system to punish those big entities that try to get away with economic externalities in terms of massive pollution, or are never held to account for the poisoning of people, whether it's in terms of big pharma or Monsanto and big agriculture or big oil, these kinds of areas. There's a lot of questions about now, how could we actually deal with this in a way that actually will make everybody's lives better, except those, at the very top of some of these pyramids of economic hierarchies, who are trying to extract every last bit of, of natural abundance and deposit the toxic remnants of that in human bodies all across the United States and the world, until we're facing an impossible to negotiate ecological crisis, health crisis, and all of those things. So, but other than those people who are probably just deluded, and need to be constrained, or sort of psychopathic and criminal in the way that they need to be held accountable via due process and justice, both criminal and civil, that everyone else will benefit from these very, pragmatic, principled, populist, prairie populism approaches to both American economics, politics, ecologics, and then we'll be able to deal with these even bigger, in certain ways, foreign policy, international affairs issues that will be front and center. So there's a lot of possibility in this moment. There's also a lot of danger, and so that's why I think it's important to not shy away from considering the dangers here, and to encourage a hardcore activism, information activism in terms of Harris-Walz at this moment, especially on the issue of Israel-Palestine, as that's sort of the immediately most destructively impactful to human lives.
Indeed. And I think with that, Jeremy, unless you have any final thoughts, I think we will wrap it up here.
Yes, I think that's good for now, and maybe what we can do is next time we can begin to focus more on the full the entire landscape in terms of American politics, and go a little bit deeper into what's going on and with Trump Vance. What is the apparent strategy for those who might be behind Trump Vance? Questions of the undermining of the election. What kind of massive disruptive, really I would say anti-American body politic integrity kinds of problems we might be facing in the middle of this political season. And then finally, I just say, just end up in terms of Walz, that there, the question of Walz and Israel, Walz Palestine, and the background of his both education and educating. He is like he taught genocide and Holocaust, but it seemed like that he taught Holocaust in a way that is outside of what Norman Finkelstein would call the Holocaust industry, which I actually totally reject. Even the nomenclature of Holocaust brought in a couple decades after the actual physical facts on the ground of what, if you're talking from a just specifically Jewish perspective, would be called, European Shoah, in terms of, surrounding World War II and that whole scenario. But Walz taught Holocaust as a question of how do you how do you identify genocides before they happen, and then stop them while they're happening. So with that background, Walz must be held to account of the question of the attempted national genocide against the Palestinian people, in whole or in part, in terms of intent and in a physical manner, as the VP selection of Harris, who's the VP in an executive branch in power right now, with power to show who the GD superpower is in terms of the highest level international terrorists that I think we have, which is like this
Right.
Netanyahu, Smotrich, Ben Gvir kind of crew. And then the sort of weaponized, hard-nosed kind of JQ folks will say Walz was educated by he sort of belongs to Jewish educators. They won't really tell you that what they're actually talking about is Walz's background with Paul Wellstone and the Wellstone organization. So it's a very specific group of Jewish educators, and so I'll just leave that on the table in terms of it's very possible that Paul Wellstone, a Jewish Jewish American public servant of the people, it looks like, was very likely targeted for assassination in a plane crash by the Cheney Netanyahu 9/11 to Iraq war crew. So I would sort of say we should consider the actual reality, facts, and complexity of the background of Walz's Jewish education.
Well, would you rather have him educated by, I don't know, by people within the Paul Wellstone adjacent circles, or within the Norm Coleman adjacent circles, the senator turned head of the Republican Jewish coalition? If you said Norm Coleman, well, then you might just be a supporter of somebody who was really liked by him, who became president on the backs of what we know as the alt-right to a large extent.
Yeah. Exactly.
So anyway, on that note, and at the very least, I think my final point, at the very least, circle off what you said, is that at least it looks like Walz's philosophy is, and it is going to have to, the money, you have to, your money's going to have to be met where your mouth is in terms of issues of free speech and free discourse around these controversial topics historically. But at the very least, it seems like the philosophy is, your genocide is no more special than anyone else's, which obviously is not something that people within the serious Zionist lobby communities, both financially, economically, and then in terms of pushing domestic policy narratives centered around hate speech and around certain proposals, they're not a fan of. So.
A very important point, that the purpose is not to make more or less special anyone's suffering or genocide or atrocities that they've suffered, But to the main point is to identify and prevent or stop those things from happening, especially as they are happening in this case right now in Gaza. So
Yes,
yeah.
indeed. And with that, Jeremy, it's been great talking with you, and we'll do this again soon.
All right. Thank you very much, Greg. And thank you, everybody out there. We appreciate you. And until next time, AnteDote, we are out.